then I was like, oh, this is the real job of architecture. This is what we really should be thinking about is like how are we building in a way that's sustainable, not just from like a material standpoint, but for the community that they're serving.
Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, inspiration, and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your questions answered, and contribute to the community dialogue. There's loads of free information for experienced professionals and people just starting out on their Passive House journey. We hope to see you at one of our weekly Passive House Accelerator live webinars. In the meantime, here's this week's Passive House podcast. Welcome back to the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler, coming to you from Auckland in New Zealand, and I'm joined this week by Jay Fox. How you going, Jay?
I am doing very well today. How are you?
Yeah, pretty good. Pretty good. I think we're in that kind of getting towards that shoulder season, end of summer for me. So hopefully days are getting a bit longer for you, starting to not be quite as cold.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'll be going up to New York soon, where it is going to still be cold, and then to Syracuse, where I think they've gotten 128 inches of snow this
Oof.
winter so far. So hopefully it's
Uh,
by the time I get
yeah,
up there.
and we're going to be talking about that. I think it's because are you going up there for a particular event?
I am. It's the subject of today's podcast.
Yeah.
Well, two people who are going to be speaking. So this is the New York State Green Building Conference in Syracuse, New York, March 5th and March 6th.
Awesome. Well, we'll get into that and a bit of the conversation because it's some really great stuff, specifically about retrofitting, which is one of my favorite topics, a very important topic. But before we get into that, I just want to say a big shout out to this week Held Architecture, who is the accelerator partner of the week. So a big thanks to them. And also a big thanks to our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA, and founding sponsors of the Passive House Accelerator, 475 High Performance Building Supply, Ingui Architecture, Partel, Rockwool, and Zola. And thanks also to our champion sponsors, Buizo, Cascadia Windows and Doors, European Architectural Supply, Icon Windows and Doors, Intelligent Membranes, LG, Proseco, and Source 2050. And let's get into this week's conversation. Jay, you caught up with Tony and Caitlyn from, well, where tell us a little bit about Cycle because there are two flavors of Cycle now.
Well, cycle architecture and planning, folks who are familiar with the accelerator's work may recognize that name because they were very, very early on during back when we still had the happy hour during COVID, I believe. They presented on a project in Brooklyn, St. Mark's Passive House that finally got certified just a couple weeks ago, it sounds like.
Mm.
So they're based in Brooklyn. Caitlyn has since moved to upstate New York. And then there's Cycle Retrotech, which is going to be really the focus of our conversation today. And that is more concerned with retrofits and trying to just speed up the process of retrofitting New York and the States.
And we mentioned Energy Sprong, which a few people will be familiar with, and that's the basis of a standardized approach, panelized retrofits, which is around out of the Netherlands originally and is spread across Europe and the UK. And I believe there is a global alliance now of Energy Sprong, so you can check that out. And I think a few people might be doing it around the US, Jay, but this sort of not necessarily affiliated formally with Energy Sprong, but a similar sort of principle.
Yes, and that's Retrofit New York. I believe they at least went to Europe to study it, and I think that they modeled a lot of their initial approaches on Energy Sprong. So I kind of throw that out there, assuming knowledge. So that's the background for everyone.
Well, it's a great, if people haven't heard of that, and even if you had, definitely check out energysprong.org because there's some really great visualizations there and a description of what that process is trying to do to sort of standardize panelization and yeah, get retrofits happening at a larger scale across, that just a large volume of homes that need and buildings as well that need retrofitting, which is a big part of the conversation that you have with Tony and Caitlyn. Just one other quick mention before we jump in, saddle heat pumps comes up in this conversation. What is a saddle heat pump, Joe?
A saddle heat pump, like it sounds, it sits like a on your windowsill, both inside and out, kind of like a saddle. And if folks remember Gradient, who was a sponsor of the accelerator, Gradient's probably the most prominent one in the States. They're doing very well. I know the NYSERDA, Tony mentions a NYSERDA pilot program, which they were a part of. That was in Red Hook, and NYSERDA, of course, is New York City Housing Authority. They run all the city-owned housing.
And I guess the great thing about those is that they sort of a plug and play, right? You don't need to install with pipe works. You don't need to drill any holes through the wall. You just sit it on the window and plug it in. Yeah,
it's like a window air conditioner, but works for heating. So really, really cool invention. And like I said, Gradient's the one I know the best, but hopefully there's some other folks doing it because it's a technology we could definitely use for a kind of stopgap as we decarbonize and do some more work on our buildings.
Awesome. All right, well, let's jump in. This is, Jay, your conversation with Tony and Caitlyn of Cycle Retrotech.
Welcome back to the Passive House Podcast. My name is Jay Fox. I am your co-host. I'm here today with two folks from Cycle Retrotech. We have Tony Daniels, the principal, and Caitlyn Matusewicz, a partner. So thank you both for being here.
Great to be here, Jay.
Wonderful to be here. Thanks.
Okay, fantastic. Well, just to kick off for those who aren't familiar with your firm and your work, I guess what led to your interest in high performance architecture and design, and what's kind of the guiding principle of the firm?
Well, I can start because I think each of us has our own story of how we got here. But for me, I in the 90s, I was not entirely certain I was going to be an architect. But then I made the commitment, and one of the things that I thought about at the time was, well, what's the use of an architect going into the next century? And I foresaw that the biggest issue that we were going to face was the impact of buildings on the environment. And I got very serious about energy efficiency and sustainable design, life cycle, resilience, all of that. I was a very early adopter, went to some of the very first U.S. Green Building Conference meetings, in the early aughts, and finally started Cycle in 2007, as an architecture practice. And we sort of fought through some really hard times getting started. But then, we had some legacy clients, from the city and the UN development program, where we were doing, green building program implementation alongside architecture. And then, we got our break, really, I'd say, post Sandy, where we did about 35 buildings under the Build It Back program. Oh, wow. And started learning about resilience and scale in a new way. And since that time, we've been focused primarily on multifamily housing, because that's an area where we saw that we could really make an impact. We made a commitment to Passive House. I earned my Passive House credential. Caitlyn earned hers. We have several others in the office who've done so. And we just now, finally, after some commercial hijinks and adventure, received a certification from PHI for our first Passive House. It's a 10-story apartment building. And that I'm sure Caitlyn could tell you more about that. And I think we might have actually talked about it once several years ago here.
Is this the St. Mark's one?
Yeah.
Okay. That was a bit ago. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. But it's finally certified.
All right. Awesome.
So we, so that's what took me in, and that's been, I guess, sort of a guiding principle of the office. And I'm sure Caitlyn has, her own story to tell on this.
Yeah, sure. It's funny, there is some overlap, but I think in the question you was there a light bulb that went out or went off rather. And I would say, yeah, there definitely was a light bulb. I was in school, undergrad for architecture, and really wasn't convinced I was going to be an architect either. Really was not thriving in a school of architecture, but I ended up meeting an electrical engineering professor who was raised in Ghana, and he was taking electrical engineering students back to look at like what the power embodied energy of a community is in a rural South community in Ghana. And he started thinking about the energy that went into women carrying wood for the fires that they used for cooking energy, and the like health issues of using kerosene lit lanterns. And he decided he wanted to pursue what like the mud hut of the 21st century could be, using local materials and considering like labor equity in the way that the communities are running. And I was the first architect invited to the project. And it was supposed to be like a summer trip, but I started thinking about where materials are coming from and who's doing the labor, and what does a resilient building actually look like or mean in specific communities. And then I was like, oh, this is the real job of architecture. This is what we really should be thinking about, is like, how are we building, in a way that's sustainable, not just from like a material standpoint, but for the community that they're serving. So flash forward, that became my thesis for undergrad, and I applied for a bunch of jobs outside of college. But I was looking for a firm that talked about equity in the workforce, that they had a live-work balance, and that was interested in issues of sustainability. And that ended up, I applied for Cycle in 2011 and finally got a call back in 2014. Actually, no, I interviewed, wasn't a good fit. And then in 2014, got another call. I'd been working with UNICEF in Southeast Asia doing pre-primary school design and like community surveys. And Tony reached out and said, hey, now that you've got a little bit of experience, maybe you'd be a better fit. And so that's the long story short. I've been there now, I think like 12 years, working on all of the things that Tony just mentioned, and really excited that we're hitting this stride with retrofits.
Yeah, moving into the kind of the retrofit question, because I think that's what we want to focus on, and that's the subject of the presentation at the New York State Green Building Conference in Syracuse, which is coming up March 5th and 6th, and that is going to be in Syracuse again. So just what is the presentation going to cover, and what, I don't know, try to entice our listeners to make them go.
Yeah, sure. I'll do what I can. The theme of the conference this year aptly is adapt, innovate, and advance.
Mm-hmm.
And so I am part of a team with Bess Credemeyer at the School of Architecture at Syracuse University, and Nina Wilson, who is also in the School of Architecture. But our presentation spans two projects that both professors have led. Or, Nina led the first one at Winding Ridge and Bess took on the other. They're essentially the same form factor buildings in South Campus. They're dorm buildings. And we kind of trace the evolution or adaptation of our deep energy retrofit strategies across the two projects. And, neither project, we didn't have the same team. They didn't have the same energy targets. They had different schedule constraints, but there was a similar approach around coordinated systems with the envelope and HVAC working together for the retrofit, designing from the outside to minimize disruption for residents, and then also integrated design and research, where the teams are brought in from pre-retrofit assessment to like post-retrofit commissioning. And so anyway, those are we talk about how we're similar, but then we go into the details of how very different the projects are from, all of the ways that we addressed the goals. But essentially we set ourselves up for how we're going to adapt these approaches, or thinking about deep energy or retrofits to go to the next iteration. And kind of miraculously, both projects resulted in buildings that save 70% or more in thermal energy. But yeah, just how different the strategies are that led to similar performance, I think, is going to be a big takeaway. And it's an invitation for innovation for the crowd as well. We've got some points that we're like, we want to keep picking at these and inviting the crowd to participate. So there'll also be a panel. So we're doing a deep dive technical review, and then there's a breadth of experience on our panel that will be discussing next steps and innovations.
Very cool. Tony, do you want to add to that?
Well, I mean, first of all, Caitlyn really ran that project for us. So, you'll get the news from her at the conference. I will be on the panel, and I hope to add something of meaning to it. What I will say is that one of the interesting contrasts between the projects is that at Lambeth Lane, the project that Caitlyn led, and that cycle delivered, for under the, this was a ABC collaborative, funded by Department of Energy. We really adopted a modular strategy, and we have a panelized exterior overclad for the building, and we also have a modular-ish mechanical system that included both not only sort of a pod for mechanical equipment, but sort of like this chimney piece also that was prefabricated offsite for running the pipes at the building. So we definitely learned a lot of lessons, not only about the applicability of these typologies, but in how to implement and plan for doing that kind of work.
Yeah. Wow. And this is speaking to exactly where I kind of wanted to go with just kind of panelization and industrializing retrofits. How, I guess that's always going to be one of the difficulties is that each project is unique. And so can you speak of specifically what makes it more difficult than doing new construction? What are kind of some of those specific hiccups that tend to come up time and time again because each building is slightly different for an existing one?
Well, we're looking to find ways to scale.
Mm-hmm.
And if you start from the point that all buildings are special and unique and have unique problems, you'll never be able to do it, because you're just assuming you're going to walk into a new project,
mm-hmm.
and here I am right at square one, and that you will never scale.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a real problem. In fact, it's almost problematic to think of these things, these efforts, as projects, because that implies that there's going to be a special project team, and there's going to be a special project legal configuration, and there's all of these sort of configuration settings,
mm-hmm.
would be different and have to be sort of massaged into creating the project. And by the time that happens, then the RFP goes out to the architect, and then it really becomes a project, because you're spending money on professionals. And then the architect and the team develop a project
Yep.
based on a budget that they didn't create, and that may or may not be sufficient to deliver a good result. And that because of that, you have to try and shoehorn the scope into whatever the budget is.
Yeah.
And it's basically because, nobody takes the sort of a contravening position, right? Which is that, we have a solution. We have a retrofit, and these are the elements of the retrofit. And this is actually what Cycle Retrotech is all about. I mean, we are operationally aligned with Cycle Architecture, our architecture practice, and we provide architectural services. But when it comes to doing a retrofit, we start with a solution, and it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. There's some things that we just don't do. Historical buildings, buildings with really, really complex facades. That's commercial buildings. We really are focused, on multifamily. We don't do no single family. It's like we've already narrowed it. And what we find is that there are so many similarities there in the solution. Right now, you might have buildings that have gas. You might have existing buildings that are that have electric resistance heat. You have varying, there's some variations, right? You might have masonry bearing wall, block and plank building, or you might have a concrete frame with a brick veneer. But that's like, we can work with that. We can find a solution that can address all the structural and mechanical configurations of those buildings.
Yeah.
So we start with a solution, and that enables us to hone in on integrations and efficiencies, both in design and construction. We can develop hopefully a much more accurate picture of a project cost ahead of time, which can help with project underwriting. And we can also, from a performance standpoint, we can look at what the performance of the building is going to be, what the energy savings are going to be. We can project out the net operating income of the building, and the overall cost of ownership, so that again we can figure out what the funding sources can look like, and what the funding stack can look like, what the budget can be. And we've had some success at this, with some more recent projects. For example, a project came to us with a budget of $1.5 million, and we've through our efforts at scoping, finding grants, predicting outcomes, that budget has been increased about $5.5 million, and they're going to get new windows and a completely new mechanical system. And we're not done. We think we can get them a little bit more, excuse me, to be able to do an overclad as well, and really future-proof this building. Huh. So that I think, is that a technical challenge? I mean, there are plenty of technical challenges, but we're really looking to find solutions that can scale.
Yeah.
And building the the integrations and the efficiencies that can allow that to happen.
And this is maybe going into uncharted territory, so I apologize, but I'm just like, are you trying to identify like, all right, here's row after row after street of like row homes in Bed-Stuy or Carroll Gardens or something like that, where they're very, very similar? Like, can we take a few as kind of these, like, I don't want to say archetype, but it just like you do
exactly
a pilot
right.
on a few of them and then just replicate, and like don't worry about the really bizarre buildings that are going to be difficult to do with a ton of like nuances. Focus on the similar ones.
Yeah, archetype is exactly the right word. By the way, for this, that we have, it's one that we've talked about, but we haven't been able to come up with anything better, actually. So it was like spot on. But like that's not where we're working. I mean, we're working at a somewhat larger scale.
Okay.
But I think once we learn these lessons, we could probably just as easily apply a solution to to these sort of row house types that that you see everywhere. Problem is, at least in North and West Brooklyn, a lot of these are historic buildings and historic districts.
Yeah.
And so the solution is probably more akin to just the mechanical systems upgrade and maybe some blown in insulation and a cavity on the inside. So it's a little bit different.
Okay. Caitlyn, sorry, do you have anything to add? I feel like we've kind of
I'm sorry. I just got going, and
that's fine.
I think the question was, what's fundamentally more complex about these retrofits? And obviously everything Tony just described is very complex, and we're putting those pieces together. I would add, obviously, building geometry, existing building geometries, even in the most archetypal, typologies, like you still end up with non-straight lines and existing construction that can't be relied upon. And so, addressing how we're capturing existing conditions and then using those to fabricate where our solution is mostly from the outside, that's like a big process innovation that we're working on to try to solve some of that complexity. And then obviously, ideally, people are not being displaced by this work. So dealing with residents in place, the extent of coordination that we need to do and limiting the work as much as possible within units. So, that's also additionally complex. And it's from the project intake where we're getting existing conditions documented through construction and how you're managing around people's lives basically to do the work. So I would just add that to what Tony said.
And this is one thing I want to touch on because I know it's difficult to coordinate, but you mentioned, people trying to not disrupt people's lives while you're doing the work. Any advice for someone who's, starting out, they've got, they've been hired to do this retrofit and they're kind of new to it. Like, what advice would you give them? Like, these are kind of best practices to avoid totally disrupting the occupants' lives.
I can lay out a few things, and then Caitlyn, you may want to elaborate on some. But first of all, have a plan to figure out how you're going to contact the residents. That have a method for doing it. Have your organization set, coordinate it with the owner, the building owner. And, God forbid you should have to do this work for a co-op or a condo, because then it becomes orders of magnitude more complicated.
Yeah.
But, still there are ways. Have a way to get information out to all the residents. Have FAQs, about the work so that they understand. Be prepared. Don't expect that you're going to be able to just show them an architectural plan and they're going to understand it. You have to take the time to make diagrams and drawings that really communicate what's going to be happening in their apartments. I don't know, Caitlyn, you probably have much more on this.
I'm just thinking you hit like the major aspects of it. I think through like, how long are the residents living in these buildings? Is this their home forever? Are they passing through? And tailoring your communications with both the owner and the residents to fit that. We're seeing, depending on the type of residency, you want to tailor your communications plan. But for a lot of the work we're doing, it's people are going to live there until they die. So like,
yeah,
they should be involved in decision making, and it's up to the owners, obviously. But like, the more involved residents feel the more involved they feel in the process of how the work is getting scoped, and then what the project's going to look like, what their finishes are going to be, what the building looks like, how it relates to their communities. If they have a role in that process, even like, a few engagement sessions and picking from some, selections, it makes them so engaged in the work that you can take that energy into construction, and you've got some goodwill between all of the partners. And I think that goodwill is absolutely essential. It doesn't work if anyone's feeling like they're being, left out of the process, or they didn't get a fair shot at lending their opinion. So anyway, I would just add to that.
Okay. No, that's I've been to a lot of community meetings, and the more that you can engage and make people feel heard, usually the better the outcome.
It's actually really, really important, because entering into the apartments during construction is a real cost driver. And if you are looking to do things at scale, you've got to find every possible way you can reduce the cost.
Yeah.
So it's really worth the investment up front to have a good resident engagement and communications plan.
Great advice. Then I guess I wanted to move to sequencing. This is a little bit off subject, but just like in case of like a phased retrofit where, maybe an owner doesn't have the money to do everything all at once, but they plan to eventually, over the course of, let's say, 7 or 8 years, really boost the performance of the building. What would you kind of recommend for like the first stages of that retrofit, and then like what could kind of wait, and what would you say is like absolutely don't do this first, like there needs to be a sequence for everything to make sense?
Well, I guess what I would say is that, gosh, you really have, you really have to do a very careful study of whether or not you actually don't have the money. Because if you disaggregate and disintegrate a retrofit in this way, you are going to pay more. You're going to, like, the disruption to residents is going to be much, much greater. So the first thing I would do is I would try and see if there's a way we can make it work to get as much done, ahead of time. And just from a value perspective, that's the right move. That if the value of the building will immediately increase because the cost of ownership is going to go down, and the net operating income is going to go up. So just that will be immediate. And the benefits will be immediate, and people can get on with their lives without living through like a 7-year process. And that's like, so that's the first thing. But we know about budget constraints, and sometimes there are increments. So the next thing I would do is look for something that would last for the next 10 years. And one thing that I think is very interesting is there's a lot of, for instance, at NYSERDA, they're installing saddle type unit heat pumps, and we're actually involved in a study of this, where we're looking at the performance, and the initial results are that there's quite a bit of savings from unit heat pumps. There's these like Midea and Gradient to make heat pumps that they just sort of sit like a saddle on the windowsill. And that's so that is a relatively inexpensive way to buy time.
Yeah.
With the technology that's that's okay, that doesn't require a high expenditure at first. If you don't have something like that, which is like a quick fix that's going to buy you time, then probably I would say replace your windows and insulate. But that's really, really expensive. And if you don't couple it with mechanical system improvements, it's hard to make the value case for doing it.
And it's going to be the case of like my old Sunset Park apartment where it overheats because that's how it's designed. So I'm just going to leave the window open as they run the radiator nonstop throughout the winter. I did want to ask about the building I saw on your website, 1240 Bedford. It looks very much like kind of you're taking a panelized approach, as you had mentioned before. I'm just curious, what exactly is going on there? And are you taking kind of like the Energy Sprong approach, or is that like, I don't know, am I reading too much into one image and kind of making my own narrative?
Well, no, I mean, we often asked ourselves that question, but 1240 Bedford and Caitlyn, I mean, you talk about this too, but 1240 Bedford is it's a condo, and it was budget challenged, and we really went through iteration after iteration of trying to figure out what we could do to meet their budget. And it's a condo. Condos are like resource constrained because financially it's just a set of, in this case, 43 individual mortgages, right? So there's no way to really sort of finance it except against the condo association dues. And so we were looking for all kinds of incentives, and we had to, the scope remained fluid throughout, which was kind of a problem. actually. You know, it led to a lot more management time. But in the end, we were able to install we did some boiler upgrades. And, you know, we replaced boilers because the boilers in the building were just failing, like literally failing, like no heat failing, you know, like emergency.
Yeah.
And we were able to, you know, repair the facade, which was literally falling off the building. Building, surprisingly, that was built in 2007.
2007?
Yeah.
What? Wow. Okay.
Right. And the facade was already falling off. And
Yeah.
that's because the developer went bankrupt and couldn't finish the project. So it was really, you know, it was really a white elephant. I mean, that building, I mean, it just, they're buildings that are special snowflakes, and then this definitely. But, you know, our intrepid team, we tried to figure out a way to panelize the exterior of the building. And, you know, we had been interested in this for a while. We did some work for NYSERDA to you know, to attempt this. And then, you know, the project that Caitlyn's going to be talking about at the conference, you know, also had a panelized approach. And, you know, we were keen on it, and we found a company called Dextal, and we're working with Dextal to apply a panelized facade to this building. And all of the questions that Caitlyn alluded to before, well, such as like there's not a single straight line, and, you know, it was especially true at 1240 Bedford. And it was really a learning experience for us. You know, we had to learn how to survey, how to convey that survey information to a fabricator, how to set up on site to align the, you know, the panels. And, you know, so a lot of learnings from a project like that was very, very difficult. But it's just about done now. And, you know, you can drive by it, and you can see that, you know, we've got these beautiful, you know, terracotta colored panels, you know, with high performing triple glazed windows in them. And it's yeah, I mean, we're getting ready to talk about the project a lot now that it's, I mean, now that it's done.
It's like that's a little PTSD in your voice right there.
It's been an adventure, but I have to say that everybody involved in the project, you know, the owners, Amit in particular, has been a real champion for the project, you know, on the building side, from our own team, from CVM Construction, the contractors, Dextal. I mean, really, it's, you know, although it has been a very challenging project on which we learned a lot. I mean, the challenge was not that, you know, that people were hard to work with. I mean, it's you know, really, it's been, you know, we all learned a lot.
Right. And yeah, Caitlyn, do you want to add to like some of the lessons there? Sorry if the wound is still fresh, but yeah, any lessons learned and what you hope to apply, you know, those lessons to future projects?
I think it's like the lessons learned are coming kind of fast and furious from a number of projects. On this one, yeah, I think the process of getting existing conditions documented is, we learned exactly how critical, and some methods for doing that. Also, who's capable of doing it in the, you know, in New York City area and willing to work that way. You know, Dextal, I wanted to just make a point. The reason Dextal has been such a good partner, you know, this was a pilot for them as well. And so we all have these, like, what we're learning from it and applying to our individual fields. So I think the collaboration is really beneficial. Yeah, I think that would summarize it.
Okay. And I guess I mentioned Energy Sprong earlier, and I'm kind of assuming that everyone has a knowledge of that, because that was like a huge buzzword around the Passive House community a few years ago. And are you seeing more of that kind of panelized, industrialized approach taking off a bit in New York, or is it still like everybody loves the idea, but it's just like there haven't been enough projects yet to really kick it into high gear. I feel like this is a great example of one actually like getting to the completion, which I've ran into like 5. So that's why I'm not the most positive framing of that question, but hopefully you have a more optimistic outlook.
I would just say that NYSERDA's focus on Energy Sprong and their adaptation to retrofit New York was an attempt, right? And we're actually working on the only retrofit New York project that's being built. And is that, correct me if I'm
The only
saying
one
that.
that's now being built, but there were other ones, but it's the only panelized one, I think, is.
Yeah, with the Energy Sprong panelization method, and Hugo from our office is running that one, but it is applying these strategies of overclad, like panelized overcladding, and this is a unitized heat pump like implementation. And yeah, I hope this strategy does work. We're testing out a couple different panelization options from Tremco, so it's the Revitalight and Federlight panels. Yeah, and I know they're investing in the processes too. So we're all kind of in this canoe trying still to see how it will work.
Mhm.
And what I would add to that is that I think the reason that you haven't seen a lot of panelization projects, besides the fact that, we're all still figuring out how to do it, although I think we might have it at Cycle, is that it's expensive.
Yeah.
And that's why I was talking all about cost before, because that's really key. But I want to point out that the cost of an Energy Sprong project in the past 10 years has been cut in half, and that's simply because of economies of scale and increased commitment to do it.
Mhm.
And if in talking with developers, about this and that sort of real estate shorthand, these are not for profit building owners. They give a number that would pencil out for them to undertake a retrofit, right? And it's X number of dollars per unit. And right now, we can do it for about 1.7x.
Okay.
Right. And that is, but I mean, our retrofit solution is really comprehensive, and their 1x solution is whatever 1x will buy.
Yeah.
So we think there's a way to get there, that that we can deliver that that value through integration and scale and so on.
And you mentioned NYSERDA, like I've worked a lot with NYSERDA, like as between NYSERDA and other state or city agencies, I'll leave the feds out of this for obvious reasons. Are they kind of helping with that disparity between the 1x and the 1.7x that you're seeing? Like, are they funding this to make it more scalable, or is that still, I don't know, still a little bit ways off?
Well, I just want to credit Caitlyn for getting us involved with NYSERDA, because I was really skeptical about them at the outset. They seem like gatekeepers or whatever, but Caitlyn said, "Wait, we should do this retrofit New York thing. We should put together a team. We should do it." And so we did.
Mm-hmm.
And we now have a very rich relationship with NYSERDA. We collaborate with them across a number of different projects, and we found that as an organization, as an institution, that they really are committed to innovation. They have programs that are indispensable to making it happen.
Mm-hmm.
Like the Empire Building Challenge, and they have even just sort of help me with the word. It's just
buildings of excellence, or
oh no, not buildings of excellence. Even just like the just the ordinary incentives.
Okay.
The measure-based incentives.
Thank you, Caitlyn.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. I wasn't quite sure, but yeah.
Yeah. Even those programs, I mean, have just been extraordinarily helpful.
Mm-hmm.
what we would like to see, and what I think probably NYSERDA as well internally would like to see is, an economy that is better suited and more geared towards doing these kinds of retrofits.
Yeah.
But that's a really, really hard thing to do. I mean, compared to just like, giving people, some, extra funds to electrify.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that speaks to one of the final questions I want to ask, not the final, but like, how could they help? Like, how could a city and state kind of help to grow the economy of scale to make this kind of like widespread retrofits possible? Is it just funding, or is it like what technological obstacles could they help you kind of overcome?
Yeah, I mean, I think, NYSERDA can just stay the course, and and continue to advocate, and work with the Public Service Commission on electrification and so on. That all of that is good. That's in their wheelhouse. But in the overall arena, some of the obstacles that we see are in contracting. And one of the things that we are trying to do is integrate directly with manufacturers and develop sort of standalone integrated solutions where we can leverage repetition to make it better and better and better. Just if you buy a Prius today, it doesn't look anything like a 2006 Prius because it's just been in
They've worked the bugs out.
Exactly over the years. And if we can adopt that kind of industrial process and quality control to a retrofit solution, that's one way we can drive the price down, or deliver more for less. But there are impediments to doing that, and a lot of them are contracting impediments. What you're allowed to do as an architect, there are the insurance regime guarantees disintegration and siloing because of where it wants liability to go. And so really, the thing that's going to help the most is probably the thing that I can affect the least, except to like stand here and wave my hands. But we need to figure out a new way to do this kind of contracting. Who you hire, why you hire them, and how it's supposed to work. I mean, that has to be reorganized. Otherwise, as an architect, I started out and we were running, we drew on Mylar and we fed it through blueprint machines, right? Now we have automated Revit with specialized families, and we can crank out a set like that. So our, my small architecture firm is doing what when I came out, we had like 30 people in the office where I worked, and we do a higher dollar volume of at cycle with under 10.
Jeez.
Right. So like, and contractors, they've adopted the same technology. The thing that has not changed is the business insurance models and legal structures that operate as constraints on being able to do this kind of integration. And I don't know. I'm really sorry for rambling about this, but this is a soapbox upon which I wish to stand. If we can work these bugs out, if we can develop ways to manage quality, transparency, and responsibility in these kinds of integrated models, and encourage other people to do it so that we can really have a market. I mean, I would love, like Cycle Retrotech right now, I think is singular. I'd love it if there were 10 companies doing what we're doing. And figuring out and doing their own integrations and integrating retrofits. And, we'd find that, some people had insights about, row houses in Brooklyn, and some would have insights about multifamily, and some would have insights about high rise, and that there can really be a major industry change as a result. So I don't know, that's my take on what the big obstacles are.
Okay, Caitlyn, do you want to add to that?
I think Tony hit all of the really important nails on the head, but I would say, just from my short tenure living outside of the city, and we're talking about statewide, like electricity rates, and how we're talking about governance, right? We're like, how these things are, how our representatives are helping us or not helping us in terms of the way that these rates are, especially around electricity and electrification projects, that they won't pencil with the way that the hikes are being applied right now. And like, just I live in an all electric house right now, and in the 6 months that I've lived here, our rate has doubled. So like, it's a really big problem.
So, oh God, that sucks. I didn't realize it was
And I
like,
know everyone's talking about it, and all of my local reps are working on it, but we're like basically held hostage until there's a resolution.
we haven't, yeah, again, I'm also in a single family dominated kind of area, and like you would think, I don't know, we just haven't seen the data centers built up here quite the same. And so we're not, it's gone up, but nothing like that. That's insane. I don't have a follow-up. I'm just kind of gobsmacked by that. So like, are you getting like solar on your house, do you hope, or?
Yeah, it didn't pencil 6 months ago, and it's looking much nicer, like, at this point. Solar battery backup for sure. Insulating where we can, and adding secondary fires, like wood burning, high efficiency wood stoves is like the strategy here.
Oh my God. Okay, that's a good strategy to have. So quick that like you just have to like on a dime turn like that.
Well, and I think your question was about how do we have our state and local representatives and agencies help? It's like, look into these big culprits of the hindrances, right? Like, yeah, at least.
So this is going way off the beaten path here, but I was recently introduced to a concept that's like 200 years old, but I'd never heard of it before, called ILF, which is wealth comes from the word wheel. So it's like it's a financial gain for an individual, but kind of the assumption that the financial gain for the individual makes the community better because they now have more resources. And ILF is the opposite of that. It's an individual gain that actually is the detriment of everybody around it. And I'm seeing a lot of ILF in, because of income inequality or environmental degradation or any of these other issues. And it's just like, this is a very clear example of it. It was poo-pooed by economists. The economist who came up with it is from like the 19th century, John Ruskin. But it's like,
You have to crack that book again. That sounds really relevant.
yeah, right. It's like, and I see you speaking of books, I see Color of Law there, which is a very, very good book. But yeah,
everybody should read that book.
yes. But this concept of ILF, it's just like, and Caitlyn, when you were talking about, I was picturing in my head the kind of, A through C, in environmental, Chris Magwood's like whole life cycle of something, and how just not paying attention to how extractive certain economic systems can be, and how it doesn't think about what has to happen to these products at their end of their life. It's just it ends up hurting consumers and costing society a lot. I'll stop being on my soapbox because I'm supposed to be the host and not the one talking, and that's why I'm the writer usually, and not the host.
That was interesting.
Well, look into it. I think a lot of people, it kind of was like a word that popped up. The guy wrote about it, and then nobody followed through. So if you read Naked Capitalism, which is a good blog, they brought it up. Anyway, moving on to the final question. I want to know, in your view, what is the architect's role in scaling deep retrofits? And do you see yourselves as technical innovators, process designers, advocates, or something else entirely?
Yes. I mean, look, I guess I kind of touched, you know, I'm sorry. I'm gonna bum rush this one, Caitlin, because I've been an architect for longer. So I've had more time to think about it. But you know, I'm thinking less and less about being an architect these days,
Mhm.
and it's because of the, you know, how over the course of my career I saw how architects boxed themselves into a corner and said, "Oh, we're only doing the design." And if you talk to some of these old timers, these boomer architects, that's what they'll tell you. That's what the architect's role is, to design, and then, you know, the engineers and the contractors and everybody else figures it out, and they take all the liability and all the risk, and you know, and you have a higher calling as an architect. And I can't stand that. I mean, I took my practice in the other direction entirely. You know, we're working on integrations. You know that, you know, we work a lot on the financing and the budget and planning side of things. You know, there's the old saying that, you know, by the time the architect puts pencil to paper, the budget is, you know, 80%, you know, spent.
Yeah.
You know, just in the conception of the project. That's you know, something that's guided me. I mean, I've always thought that architects should take a much more expansive role, and maybe what that means is, well, I have to hand in my license, you know, whatever. But I'm getting my, you know, I do my continuing ed, and I'm diligent, and I keep up with the code, and, you know, I pay my insurance, so I'm not planning on leaving anytime soon. But you know, just I I I want to be able to solve this problem, which is beyond the technical problem of building, and find a way to do these retrofits and electrification and decarbonization projects
Mhm.
In a meaningful way that has impact at scale. And so that's the thing that guides me, and that hopefully guides our practice.
I feel like I'm going to push back a little, not in anything that you said or the result of like the logic, but you know, I will say what I will about my education, but historically in antiquity, architects they built, you know, pyramids and pantheons themselves, you know, like they managed that process from the start to the end, and they were directing crews and managing the details and the engineering. And, you know, I agree. The silos of how architects and engineers and contracting and finance engines have all like dissociated. I would say like I'm I think the architect can be all of those things, right? Like that we maybe were thinking through the risk differently, or the way that contracts are going to be made. But I think it's an opportunity, like to get back to kind of how, you know, great things can happen through architecture.
That wasn't pushback. That was like, you know, that gave it depth. Right?
Yeah. That's a great way to end. Also, it's making me think of, I just covered, and I'm going to be publishing an article about Yestermorrow up in Vermont. And Caitlin, what both of you just said made me think of Yestermorrow.
Cool.
Cool.
Which is a very cool school. Anyway, well, with that, Caitlin, Tony, thank you so much for appearing on the podcast here, and I look forward to seeing you up in Syracuse.
And that was Tony and Caitlin of Cycle Retrotech in New York. Really great stuff, right from the going back to the origins you mentioned at the top there, Jay, some of those original projects that Tony and the team have been involved in, and also with the early days of the Passive House Accelerator through to today. And it's a bit of a familiar transition, that starting with green building, looking to do better, finding passive house, early involvement, and now looking to not just design fancy, beautiful, healthy new buildings, but really thinking about all those existing buildings and how do we bring those up to a decent standard and reduce their energy bills, which may also improve their value. And that's a really big challenge because there's no straight lines. And that it was really interesting hearing about the reality of doing those on-site surveys and working on a system like Energy Sprong, which is designed around standardization, which is easy when everything is straight and new, but any existing building, nothing's going to be straight, nothing's going to be perfect. So you have to account for that at the same time as standardization. And that, I guess, is the underlying challenge of this type of retrofit.
Yeah. And I think another surprise to me when we were talking about the 1240 Bedford property that the cladding system was already falling off the building
Yeah.
after 19 years. And
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to crap on developers in New York around that time, but during the housing bubble, there was such a mad rush to build that I've heard that this is a recurring problem, that a lot of buildings from that era were not the best. Not a lot of straight lines. Let's put it
No.
that way.
Well,
Yeah.
and even if it's not straight lines, it's just quality and attention to detail. I've recently helped someone go through the process of looking and buying a house, and I said to them, and it became quite clear that through anything built sort of 1930s to 1950s, great, solid. Yes, it needs a bit of work, but that work's doable. But they're generally pretty drafty, but they're probably dry. It's that era from the sort of 1980s, 1990s through to the early 2000s. They're the ones you want to really watch out for. They're probably the higher risk ones. And then you sort of hopefully come out the other side where things have improved and brand new hopefully is a bit better today. But yeah, there's definitely a patch in there where I would actually rather have something that has already stood the test of time and has probably been built maybe simpler, but also with a higher level of attention to detail and craftsmanship, and is you're able to do something with it. Yeah, so I think it's a fairly common problem of that boom creating not a fantastic standard, not a consistently great standard of building.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's been kind of my experience in my own life, as well as that one of the older buildings I lived in this was even before COVID, it was built in 1906, and it was fine. And then I
Yeah,
moved into a building built in 2019. We were the first tenants, and by the time I left, there were already, and this is 2022 or 2021, there were already huge problems with it. I mean, there were
yeah,
leaks,
yeah.
and it's just, yeah.
So it's a
I
big challenge, but also, as Tony points out, it is an opportunity to decide what to do with these buildings, and hopefully the structure is okay, and it's just a matter of improving that envelope, ideally from the outside, and that's a big part of Energy Sprong, which you discussed with Tony and Caitlyn, is ideally not having to decant buildings and get people out. You're hopefully not having to disrupt them, because often they are multi-unit as well. So you're dealing with a lot of different families and people. So you got there was that one building, I think, that had multiple different mortgages and different ownership structures. That could be a
Yeah.
nightmare if you have to get everyone out of that building, half pull it apart and then put it back together again. Whereas if you can wrap it, basically put a big jacket on the big coat on the outside of the building and make it weatherproof and insulated better, then that's really the promise of concepts like Energy Sprong.
Yeah, and I'm really excited because if you go on, I guess it will be the New York State Green Building Conference site. You can get more information about this. But the Syracuse building that they mentioned right off the top, Caitlyn mentions that they got a 70% energy use cut by doing their retrofit. If you look at it, it's kind of one of those not going to be historically preserved kind of buildings from probably the 50s, 60s, kind of brutalist looking. And yeah, exactly. You put a better jacket around it, you put better Windows systems in, and then you fix the mechanicals. And it's not, I don't know, it seems doable, which is what I
Yeah.
like about these Sprong so
And
much.
that's a significance when your electricity prices are doubling in 6 months. That yeah, getting your utility bills down by 70%, that's really meaningful.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially for, again, a a university like Syracuse, or any institution like that where you're going to be holding on to a property for a really long time, and you're the one footing the bill for the utilities. It makes a lot of sense to
Yeah,
do these
yeah,
upgrades.
yeah. The other thing that stood out for me, I really like the approach that they're not really, I didn't get the impression that they're holding on tightly to any particular IP here, and that there's lots of opportunity for others and similar companies offering a similar service to do this, because there are going to be certain these in different parts of the country, in different parts of the state, where people can work out how to do this for the type of building that is around them, and wherever you are. So I like that idea, that just putting this out there, saying, think about what the opportunities are in your region for doing something similar to this. And it's not necessarily a competitive market in the sense that there's only one or two companies that are ever going to do this. There's lots
Yeah.
of opportunity. I mean, there's so many buildings out there that need upgrading, and we can't afford, from a material point of view, or certainly from a carbon point of view, to just knock everything down and rebuild it. So, it's a real challenge for not just architects, but also product suppliers and contractors, builders, to really think about the best way to do this.
Yeah. And I would hope that a lot of, I'm going back to where I grew up in suburban Detroit, which is, these developers came in the 50s and built, big streets with single family houses, and they don't look identical, but they look fairly the same. But if you could
Mm,
kind of figure out how to do a retrofit on one or two or three, it's probably going to be replicable and the cost is going to go down. And that is a number I want to mention. I guess it's not a number, but a figure that Tony mentions, which is that the cost to do an energy strong project, at least in Europe, has been cut in half. And
yeah,
that's repetition. And that's, ultimately, the more of these you do, the cheaper it's going to get, and the
yeah,
better you're going to get it,
yeah.
able to do it.
And some exciting, he did mention scanning, and we didn't go into it in detail on this, but I have seen some of the technology and the emerging technology that's available now for setting up across from a building, and literally scanning it, and using some pretty cool software to take a photo of that building, but then also figure out those panels, and essentially customize them for that building to account for those non-straight lines and cutouts around the windows. That's pretty cool, and I can see definitely lots of opportunity for those technologies emerging, and becoming a lot more affordable for people. We've all got pretty fancy cameras in our pockets now, but it's not too much of a stretch to think that it won't be too far away, if it's not happening already, where you can just take a photo of a building, and some fancy software can figure out the size of those panels, and then send it off to some sort of CNC machine, and create them ready for just being installed, already pre-cut to size.
Yeah. And using natural materials to do it. So it's even
And then, yeah, that's the next step is looking at biophilic design, and seeing if we can get this done right
Yeah.
from the start, so we're not going to have to regret whatever we've stuck onto the our buildings in 10 years' time. Absolutely. It's a very nice convergence of many of the topics that we're covering here in the accelerator.
Yeah.
All right, so just give us the details once again, Jay, for that event coming up.
Yeah. So there'll be the 2026 New York State Green Building Conference in Syracuse, New York. That's March 5th and March 6th. It'll probably be a little chilly up there, but Syracuse is apparently a very nice town. I'm looking forward to visiting. I haven't been in probably 20 years, so should be
Nice,
fun.
nice. And also over at Reimagine, we have coming up on the following week, on March 12th, a building multifamily session is coming up. So check that out. That's Reimagine Building Multifamily on March the 12th. You can find out all about that over at Reimagine Buildings, and also, of course, at Passive House Accelerator. All right. So thank you very much, Jay. Great to see you, and have an update from Tony and Caitlyn. And we'll be back again next week on Passive House Podcast.